The Battle of Rennell Island, Japanese, took place on 29 to 30 January 1943. It was the last major naval engagement between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Guadalcanal campaign of World War II. It occurred in the South Pacific between Rennell Island and Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands. In the battle, Japanese naval land-based torpedo bombers, seeking to provide protection for the impending evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal, made several attacks over 2 days on U.S. warships operating as a task force south of this island. In addition to approaching Guadalcanal with the objective of engaging any Japanese ships that might come into range, the U.S. task force was protecting an Allied transport ship convoy carrying replacement troops there. As a result of the Japanese air attacks on the task force, one U.S. heavy cruiser was sunk, a destroyer was heavily damaged, and the rest of the U.S. task force was forced to retreat from the southern Solomons area, partly because they turned back the U.S. task force in this battle. The Japanese successfully evacuated their remaining troops from Guadalcanal by the 7th of February 1943, leaving it in the hands of the Allies and ending the battle for the island. Background: on the 7th of August 1942, Allied forces, primarily U.S., landed on Guadalcanal, Tulungi, and Florida Islands in the Solomon Islands. The landings on the islands were meant to deny their use by the Japanese as bases for threatening the supply routes between the U.S. and Australia, and to secure the islands as starting points for a campaign with the eventual goal of isolating the major Japanese base at Rabaul while also supporting the Allied New Guinea campaign. The landings initiated the 6-month-long Guadalcanal campaign, the last major attempt by the Japanese to drive Allied forces from Guadalcanal and Tulungi was defeated during the decisive naval Battle of Guadalcanal in early November 1942. Thereafter, the Japanese Navy was only able to deliver subsistence supplies and a few replacement troops to Japanese Army forces on Guadalcanal, because of the threat from Allied aircraft based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, plus nearby U.S. aircraft carriers. The Japanese delivered these supplies at night, usually by destroyer or submarine, in operations the Allies called the Tokyo Express. However, these supplies and replacements were not enough to sustain Japanese troops on the island, who by the 7th of December 1942, were losing about 50 men each day from malnutrition, disease, and Allied ground or air attacks. On the 12th of December 1942, the Japanese Navy proposed that Guadalcanal be abandoned, despite initial opposition from Army leaders, who still hoped that Guadalcanal could eventually be retaken from the Allies. On the 31st of December 1942, the Imperial General Headquarters, with approval from the Emperor, agreed to evacuate all Japanese forces from the island and establish a new line of defense for the Solomons on New Georgia. The evacuation was codenamed Operation KE, and was scheduled to begin on the 14th of January 1943. An important element in the plan was an air superiority campaign starting the 28th of January 1943, to inhibit Allied aircraft or warships from disrupting the final stage of the KE operation, which was the actual evacuation of all Japanese troops from Guadalcanal. Allied forces misinterpreted the KE preparations as the beginning of another Japanese offensive to try to retake Guadalcanal. At the same time, Admiral William Halsey, Jr., the Allied theater commander, was under pressure from his superiors to complete the replacement of the 2nd Marine Regiment, which had been in combat on Guadalcanal since August, with fresh Army troops. Halsey hoped to take advantage of what he believed was an impending Japanese offensive to draw Japanese naval forces into a battle, while at the same time delivering the replacement army troops to Guadalcanal. On 29 January 1943, Halsey sent 5 task forces toward the southern Solomons area to cover the relief convoy and to engage any Japanese naval forces that came into range. These 5 task forces included 2 fleet carriers, 2 escort carriers, 3 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 25 destroyers. In front of this array of task forces was Task Group 62.8, the troop convoy of 4 transports and 4 destroyers. Ahead of the troop convoy, between Rennell Island and Guadalcanal, was Task Force 18, TF-18, Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, a close support group of heavy cruisers USS Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, light cruisers Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia, escort carriers Chenango and Suwannee, and 8 destroyers. Admiral Giffen commanded TF-18 from Wichita. A fleet carrier task force, centered on the carrier Enterprise, steamed about 250 miles, 220 nmi, 400 kilometers, behind TG 62.8 and TF-18. The other fleet carrier and battleship task forces were about 150 miles, 130 nmi, 240 kilometers, farther back. Admiral Giffen, with Wichita and the 2 escort carriers, had just arrived in the Pacific after participating in Operation Torch in the North African campaign. Also, Chicago had just arrived back in the South Pacific, after completing repairs from damage suffered during the Battle of Savo Island almost 6 months before. Battle Prelude. In addition to protecting the troop convoy, TF-18 was charged with rendezvousing with a force of 4 U.S. destroyers, stationed at Tulungi, at 21:00 on 29 January in order to conduct a sweep up the slot north of Guadalcanal the next day to screen the unloading of the troop transports at Guadalcanal. However, the escort carriers, under Commodore Ben Wyatt, were too slow, 18 knots, 21 miles per hour, 33 kilometers per hour, to allow Giffen's force to make the scheduled rendezvous. So Giffen left the carriers behind with 2 destroyers at 14:00 and pushed on ahead at 24 knots, 28 miles per hour, 44 kilometers per hour, wary of the threat from Japanese submarines, which Allied intelligence indicated were likely in the area. Giffen arranged his cruisers and destroyers for anti-submarine defense, not expecting an air attack. The cruisers were aligned in 2 columns, spaced 2,500 yards, 2,300 meters apart. Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, in that order, were to starboard, and Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia were to port. The 6 destroyers were in a semicircle 2 miles, 1.7 nmi, 3.2 kilometers, ahead of the cruiser columns. Giffen's force was tracked by Japanese submarines, who reported its location and movement. Around mid-afternoon, based on the submarine reports, 16 Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 bombers from the 705 Air Group, 705 AG, and 16 Mitsubishi G3M Type 96 bombers from the 701 Air Group, 701 AG, took off from Rabaul carrying torpedoes to attack Giffen's force. 1 Type 96 turned back with engine trouble, leaving 31 bombers in the attack force. The leader of the 705 AG aircraft was Lieutenant Tomo Nakamura, and Lieutenant Commander Joji Hagai commanded the 701 AG planes. Action on 29 January. At sunset, as TF-18 headed northwest 50 miles, 43 nmi, 80 kilometers, north of Rennell Island and 160 miles, 140 nmi, 260 kilometers, south of Guadalcanal. Several of Giffin's ships detected unidentified aircraft on radar 60 miles, 52 nmi, 97 kilometers, west of their formation. Having previously insisted on absolute radio silence, Giffen gave no orders about what to do about the unidentified contacts, or any orders at all, for that matter. With the setting of the sun, TF-18's Combat Air Patrol, CAP, from the two escort carriers returned to their ships for the night, leaving Giffen's ships without air cover. The radar contacts were, in fact, the approaching 31 Japanese torpedo bombers, who circled around to the south of TF-18 so that they could attack from the east, with the black backdrop of the eastern sky behind them. From this direction, the Japanese bombers were hidden by the night sky, but Giffen's ships were silhouetted against the twilight of the western horizon. The 705 AG aircraft attacked first, beginning at 19:19. Nakamura's aircraft missed with all of their torpedoes and one was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from Giffen's ships. Believing the attack was over, Giffen ordered his ships to cease zigzagging and continue towards Guadalcanal on the same course, and at the same speed. Meanwhile, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft began dropping flares and float lights to mark the course and speed of TF-18 for the impending attack by Hagai's bombers. At 19:38, 701 AG attacked, planting two torpedoes in Chicago, causing heavy damage and bringing the cruiser to a dead stop. Another torpedo hit Wichita but did not explode. Two bombers were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, including Hagai's. He was killed. At 20:08, Giffen ordered his ships to reverse direction, to slow to 15 knots, 17 miles per hour, 28 kilometers per hour, and to cease firing their anti-aircraft guns. The absence of muzzle flashes concealed the ships from the Japanese aircraft, who all departed the area by 23:35. In pitch darkness, Louisville managed to take the crippled Chicago under tow and slowly headed south, away from the battle area, escorted by the rest of TF-18. Action on the 30th of January. Halsey immediately took steps to try to protect Chicago, notifying the escort carriers to make sure they had a cap in place at first light, ordering the Enterprise Task Force to approach and augment the escort carrier cap, and sending the fleet's tug Navajo to take over the tow from Louisville, which was accomplished at 08:00. Between daybreak and 14:00, numerous Japanese scout aircraft approached TF-18. Although they were all chased away by the cap, they observed and reported the position of Chicago. At 12:15, a force of 11 Type 1 torpedo bombers from the 751 Air Group, 751 AG, based at Kavieng and staging through Buka, launched to attack the damaged U.S. cruiser. An Australian coastwatcher in the Solomon Islands warned the U.S. forces of the bombers, and estimated their arrival time as 16:00. However, Halsey ordered the other cruisers to leave Chicago behind and head for Afate and the New Hebrides. They departed at 15:00, leaving behind 6 destroyers to protect Chicago and Navajo. At 15:40, Enterprise was 43 miles, 37 nmi, 69 kilometers, away from Chicago, with 10 of her fighters forming a cap over the damaged cruiser. At this time, 4 of the cap fighters chased and shot down a Scout Type 1 bomber. At 15:54, Enterprise's radar detected the incoming bomber flight, and launched 10 more fighters. The escort carriers, however, had difficulties in getting their aircraft launched. and their aircraft did not attack the bombers until the engagement was over. At first, the Japanese bombers appeared to be trying to approach and attack Enterprise but turned toward Chicago after 6 Enterprise cap fighters began to engage them. 4 other cap fighters chased the 751AG aircraft as they entered the anti-aircraft fire from Chicago's escorting destroyers. 2 of the bombers were shot down before they could release their ordnance. 6 more were shot down moments later, but not before they dropped their torpedoes. 1 torpedo hit the destroyer USS La Valette in her forward engine room, killing 22 of her crew and causing heavy damage. Chicago was hit by 4 torpedoes, 1 forward of the bridge and 3 others in her engineering spaces. Captain Ralph O. Davis of Chicago ordered the ship to be abandoned, and she sank, stern first. 20 minutes later, Navajo and the escorting destroyers rescued 1049 survivors from Chicago, but 62 of her crew died. A final attack force of Japanese torpedo bombers failed to find the remaining U.S. ships. Navajo took La Valette under tow, and all of the remaining ships of TF-18 made port at Espiritu Santo without further incident. Aftermath. The Japanese widely publicized the results of the engagement, claiming to have sunk a battleship and 3 cruisers. The U.S., on the other hand, tried to conceal the loss of Chicago from the public for some time, with Admiral Chester Nimitz threatening to shoot any of his staff who leaked the loss of Chicago to the press. Halsey and Nimitz blamed Giffen for the defeat and so stated in Giffen's official performance report for the period, the defeat and resulting recriminations did not affect Giffen's career. He continued to lead Allied battleship and cruiser task forces in the Pacific until 1944 and was later promoted to vice admiral. With Japanese aircraft engaged with TF-18, the Allied transports completed their mission of replacing the remaining Marines on Guadalcanal over the last 2 days in January 1943. During this time, the other Allied task forces, including the 2 fleet carrier task forces, took station in the Coral Sea, in anticipation of an expected Japanese offensive in the southern Solomons. In reality, however, the Japanese completed the secret evacuation of their remaining forces from Guadalcanal, Operation KE, over 3 nights between 2 and 7 February 1943, with TF-18 forced to retreat. Very few Allied naval forces were left in the immediate Guadalcanal area, allowing the Japanese to retrieve most of their remaining ground forces. The Allies did not realize the evacuation was happening until it was over. Building on their success in securing Guadalcanal, the Allies continued their campaign in the Solomon Islands to its successful conclusion. Notes. Further reading.